The sun had barely begun its climb over the patchwork fields of rural England when a distant, almost imperceptible hum began to stir the morning air. At first, it was nothing more than a whisper, a vibration that seemed to come from the sky itself. But then it grew, a steady, insistent roar, and those who were working in the fields looked up with a mixture of awe and unease. High above the hedgerows, the silhouette of a massive aircraft cut across the pale blue sky. It was a B-17 flying fortress, the pride of the Allied air fleets, its 4 engines straining against an invisible burden. To the untrained eye, it was just another bomber on a mission, another machine of war crossing the English countryside. But on this particular morning, something was terribly wrong. This was the heart of World War II, a time when the skies were not just highways, but battlefields. Every mission carried the weight of lives, the potential for glory, and the ever-present shadow of disaster. The B-17, nicknamed the Flying Fortress, had earned its reputation for being almost indestructible, a flying fortress that could endure more than most other aircraft of its kind. It had survived flak over Berlin, strafing runs over occupied France, and countless other harrowing sorties. But even a machine as formidable as this was not immune to the human element, the chaos of battle, mechanical failure, and the cruel unpredictability of fate. In a small village tucked away between rolling hills and wheat fields, the early morning quiet was shattered by the unmistakable clatter of metal struggling against air. For the local farmers, life was simple and steady. Their concerns rarely stretched beyond the health of their livestock or the timing of the harvest. Yet, in the span of a heartbeat, everything familiar was about to be thrown into uncertainty. The B-17 was not returning from a triumphant mission. Something had gone horribly wrong. Its engine sputtered and coughed, smoke trailing from one wing, a telltale sign of catastrophic failure. The bomber wobbled, its nose dipping, then climbing again, like a wounded bird attempting to regain control. The crew inside the plane fought for every inch of sky, voices shouting over the roar of engines and alarms, hands gripping controls with desperate determination. Each man knew the odds. B-17 crews were tough, trained to survive against impossible odds, but even the bravest pilots could not escape the brutal arithmetic of damaged machinery and a treacherous descent. Below, the villagers had begun to notice. Windows rattled in their frames as the plane faltered, sending hearts racing with fear. Among them was a small group whose lives were about to intersect with history in the most extraordinary way. They were ordinary people, farmers, laborers, a schoolteacher who had spent her mornings tending to children instead of engines or fields. None of them had ever imagined that their quiet, everyday lives could become part of a story that would echo far beyond the village borders. As the bomber wavered, it became clear it could not make it to a nearby airfield. The pilot's options were disappearing like sand slipping through fingers. There was no time for rescue crews to arrive, no safety nets. If the B-17 touched the ground, it would not be gentle. Every second was a battle against gravity and destiny. And yet, on that crisp morning, something remarkable was about to happen. A testament not to the power of machines, but to the ingenuity, courage, and sheer determination of human beings. The villagers, accustomed to the rhythms of planting and harvest, recognized danger before they understood it fully. Horses whinnied and bolted in the fields, dogs barked, and a few of the farmers dropped their tools, staring upward. There was a strange combination of fear and curiosity, a realization that this was no ordinary accident. The B-17 was large, heavy, and faltering. Its shadow stretched across the fields like a dark omen. And yet, for those on the ground, it presented not just a threat, but a call to action. Among the first to move was one of the local mechanics, a man who had spent his life coaxing life out of engines far smaller than the monstrous flying fortress above. He ran toward the nearest barn, gathering tools with the precision of someone who understood machinery in a language few others spoke. Hammers, wrenches, planks of wood, ropes, everything that could possibly help in an emergency. He was not a soldier, and this was not a battlefield he had trained for. but necessity has a way of transforming ordinary people into heroes. Nearby, a schoolteacher had been walking to her classroom when the distant roar caught her attention. Unlike the mechanics and farmers, her experience with engines was minimal, but her courage was equally strong. She moved instinctively, gathering whatever she could from her surroundings, not fully knowing what she would do, only that she must act. She was about to demonstrate a form of heroism rarely written in history books, the quiet, determined bravery of ordinary citizens facing extraordinary circumstances. The B-17 descended lower, each wobble bringing it closer to a fate that could have ended in disaster. The villagers watched, holding their breath, hearts pounding in unison with the straining engines. Time seemed to stretch and contract in strange ways, the seconds ticking like gunshots, each one a question. Would the plane crash, or would human ingenuity prevail? There is something profoundly cinematic about the moments when ordinary lives intersect with history. This was one of those moments. In the fields, the line between fear and action blurred. Tools became instruments of survival. Improvisation became strategy. Experience and courage intertwined, forming a lifeline that, against all odds, would attempt to save the lives of the men inside the faltering flying fortress. Even as the plane dipped lower, the villagers' resolve hardened. The mechanics and the schoolteacher, now joined by a few of the more courageous farmers, assessed the situation with eyes trained by instinct rather than manuals. They could see the undercarriage, the damaged propellers, the flaps that refused to respond. This was no ordinary repair. It was a race against death itself. The fields, usually quiet and serene, became a theater of tension, the stage set for a miracle born not of military training but of human determination and ingenuity. By now, the entire village was aware. Windows opened, doors creaked, and a tense silence fell over the community, broken only by the intermittent roar of the B-17 struggling engines. People who had spent their lives tending sheep or teaching children were now witnesses to an event that would be retold for decades. They would remember the smell of smoke, the clanging of distant tools, the sun catching on metal and eyes wide with fear. They would remember the courage that emerges when ordinary individuals confront extraordinary circumstances, and the unlikeliest of heroes rise to meet a challenge far beyond what anyone could have imagined. And so, as a massive bomber descended, wobbling like a leaf caught in a storm, a strange sense of hope began to weave through the tension. The plane was heavy, injured, and utterly at the mercy of the world below it. But below, humanity was awakening. Farmers, a mechanic, and a schoolteacher had realized something vital. They could not change the fate of the plane's engines, but they could change the fate of the crew. They could act. They could save lives using nothing more than resourcefulness, courage, and the simplest of tools. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, a story not just of war, but of the quiet, extraordinary heroism that emerges in the most unlikely of places. It was a moment that would remind the world that sometimes survival does not depend on the power of machines or the plans of generals, but on the courage of those who refuse to stand idly by. The sky above was tense, the fields below silent, and the B-17's engines screamed as though aware of the human hands poised to intervene. The story of that day would later echo across continents, a testament to ingenuity, bravery, and the unbreakable will of ordinary people thrust into the extraordinary. And it all began in a quiet English village, on a morning that would forever be etched into the annals of history, when a damaged bomber hung precariously in the air, and the fate of its crew rested in the hands of farmers, a schoolteacher, and a handful of tools. The B-17 continued its staggering descent, the roar of its engines rattling the very bones of the village below. Every farmer, every villager, every pair of eyes turned skyward, watched as the massive aircraft fought against gravity, smoke trailing like dark fingers across its wings. Inside the plane, the crew knew they were in trouble. The pilot wrestled with the controls, sweat beading on his forehead, as his co-pilot scanned the instruments with desperate intensity. There was no time for hesitation, no luxury for mistakes. They were fast approaching a field that seemed ordinary to anyone else. But in those critical seconds, it became the only thing standing between life and death. On the ground, the villagers sprang into action. The mechanics, used to dismantling engines and coaxing stubborn machines into life, now faced a challenge far beyond anything they had ever imagined. The schoolteacher, her heart pounding, her mind racing, realized she had to act not as a civilian, not as a teacher, but as a lifeline. Tools were gathered from barns, sheds, and workshops: hammers, crowbars, planks of wood, ropes, anything that might serve as a makeshift brace or lever. Every item had to be repurposed on the fly, and every decision carried monumental consequences. The B-17 wobbled lower, its wheels grazing the tops of crops, leaving a trail of destruction in its path. It became clear to the villagers that the plane could not land conventionally. Its undercarriage had been damaged, its engines failing, and any hard contact with the earth would tear it apart. But the human ingenuity on the ground was already shifting into motion. The mechanics assessed the plane's weight, the angle of its descent, the best way to absorb impact. Meanwhile, the schoolteacher coordinated, directing villagers to hold ropes in precise positions, to brace the soft soil with planks and beams, to create a controlled runway of sorts that might prevent the bomber from cartwheeling across the field. Every movement on the ground had to be timed perfectly. The B-17 was massive, over 75 feet in length, with a wingspan stretching wider than most village roads. Its engines roared in protest as it skimmed closer to the earth, the damaged propeller slicing the air with a deafening clamor. Dust and smoke spiraled upward, mixing with the smell of freshly turned soil. The villagers' hands were blistered, their arms aching from holding ropes taut, shifting beams, and pounding stakes into the ground. Yet they refused to falter. They understood instinctively that hesitation would mean certain death for the crew above. Inside the plane, a tense quiet settled over the cockpit for a few heart-stopping moments. The bombardier, peering through the nose window, could see the figures on the ground, tiny, determined, and impossibly brave against the enormity of the situation. He realized, with a mix of awe and disbelief, that these were ordinary villagers performing extraordinary acts, turning fields into a lifeline. The pilot adjusted the throttles carefully, trying to match the plane's descent to the rhythm of human effort below. One miscalculation could still mean disaster. And then, the first contact. The B-17's landing gear grazed the planks that had been positioned in the soft earth, sending splinters flying in every direction. A collective gasp rose from the villagers as the plane jolted, the shock waves rolling across the fields. Ropes stretched to their limits, beams creaked, but the mechanics and the schoolteacher held firm. Every strike of a hammer, every pull of a rope, every brace of a plank was an act of defiance against fate itself. The plane bounced once, twice, threatening to tip onto one side, but the human chain held. Using nothing but farm tools and sheer determination, the villagers absorbed the impact, slowing the B-17 just enough to prevent catastrophic damage. Mud clung to the wheels, beams cracked and twisted under the immense weight, yet they refused to let go. The schoolteacher's voice rang out above the chaos, coordinating movement, keeping the team focused. She had no military training, no engineering degree, but her authority and quick thinking became a linchpin in the operation. Minute by minute, the plane inched across the field. Each footfall of the massive bomber was matched by the villagers' tireless effort to steady it. Dust clouded the air, the sun glinting off the bomber's battered fuselage, creating a surreal tableau of struggle and ingenuity. Nearby, children who had been sent inside for safety pressed their faces against windows, witnessing what would become a defining moment of heroism in their lives. For them, it was a lesson in courage, community, and the extraordinary power of ordinary people united in a single, impossible purpose. The mechanics worked frantically to guide the plane's wheels along improvised tracks. A twisted axle here, a damaged strut there. They improvised with whatever materials they could find. inserting beams and ropes to act as shock absorbers. The B-17's engines groaned, smoke curling from under the wings, as if protesting the indignity of being guided to safety by a group of civilians with nothing but wits and courage. Yet the plane obeyed, inching forward with painstaking slowness, every movement a victory over disaster. Meanwhile, the schoolteacher moved along the field, ensuring that no plank or rope was misplaced. She shouted instructions, moving between villagers, each step a display of calm decisiveness. Fear was present, yes, but it did not dominate. It sharpened their instincts, gave them focus, transformed adrenaline into action. They had become a human safety net, an improvised rescue team against impossible odds. As the bomber approached the far end of the field, the tension reached the fever pitch. The villagers knew there was little margin for error. If the plane veered even slightly, it would tip, the fuselage would crumple, and lives would be lost. But the B-17, battered and exhausted, responded. Inch by inch, foot by foot, it moved forward, the combined efforts of pilots and villagers synchronizing in a near miraculous harmony. During the landing, small miracles unfolded. A wheel that should have collapsed held against the pressure of beams. A rope, fraying at the edges, did not snap. Every person on the ground found a hidden reserve of strength they did not know they possessed. Even the wind seemed to cooperate, gentle and steady, as though nature itself had decided to give a helping hand. The villagers, mechanics, and schoolteacher guided the plane until it came to a complete stop in the middle of the field. A silence fell over the landscape, broken only by the hiss of engines winding down and the creak of settling metal. The crew inside the B-17 exhaled for the first time in what felt like an eternity. They were alive. Every member of the bomber's team had survived, saved not by military intervention or engineered runway, but by the courage, creativity, and relentless effort of ordinary people. As the smoke cleared and adrenaline ebbed, the villagers began to comprehend what had just occurred. They had witnessed history in motion, not on a battlefield or in the pages of strategy books, but in their own fields, with nothing but planks, ropes, and human determination. The mechanics and schoolteacher, exhausted and dirt-streaked, realized they had accomplished something extraordinary. They had saved lives against impossible odds, turning an ordinary morning into a story that would be told for generations. Historians would later marvel at the combination of factors that made this rescue possible. The B-17, although damaged, had retained enough structural integrity to allow for controlled descent. The ingenuity of the villagers had turned improvisation into salvation, and the schoolteacher, whose calm leadership had guided the team, became an unsung hero in a narrative dominated by the machinery of war. The story also highlighted an interesting fact about World War II aviation. While the B-17 was known for its durability, it was vulnerable to damage that could cripple landing gear or engines. Many crews who survived bombing runs over Europe perished upon attempted landings at home bases due to mechanical failures or miscalculations. In this case, the intervention of civilians had bridged that gap, demonstrating that courage and quick thinking could sometimes rival even the most advanced technology in importance. Moreover, the event underscored the often overlooked role of civilians during wartime. While the world focused on battles fought on foreign soil, ordinary people in villages across Europe were making split-second decisions that saved lives, preserved resources, and maintained morale. It was a reminder that war was not just fought by soldiers and generals, but by communities willing to act when circumstances demanded it. The B-17's crew, once safely on the ground, would speak of the villagers' actions with awe and gratitude. They knew they had been given a second chance, a reprieve from fate that few others ever experienced. Their story would travel far beyond the fields of that small village, becoming an example of how human courage and ingenuity could intersect with machines of war to create moments of true heroism. And so, as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the fields, the villagers gathered around the plane, sharing quiet smiles and exhausted laughter. Tools were set aside, dust brushed from clothes, and the reality of what they had achieved began to sink in. They had not only saved the bomber, they had saved lives, and in doing so, had created a story that would endure long after the engines had cooled. The morning that had begun with fear and uncertainty ended with awe and relief. A flying fortress, once teetering on the edge of destruction, now rested safely in the field, thanks to the courage of a few ordinary people who refused to watch helplessly. The mechanics, farmers, and schoolteacher had demonstrated something profound. Heroism is not always forged in battle. Sometimes it is born in the quiet determination to act when all seems lost. The air was thick with tension as the B-17 sat in the field, its engines coughing and smoke curling from damaged wings. For the villagers, it was not over yet. Every eye remained fixed on the plane, every hand ready to act. The last challenge was the most dangerous the bomber had to be stabilized long enough to ensure the crew could safely exit. One wrong movement, one slack rope, one misjudged plank, and the entire rescue could collapse. The stakes had never been higher. The mechanics and schoolteachers sprang back into action, coordinating the final efforts. Beams were repositioned, ropes readjusted, and every plank reinforced. They had learned in the previous minutes how the aircraft reacted, how the weight shifted, and how the fragile combination of man and machine could be guided safely. Their movements were precise, yet every second felt like a lifetime. They were racing against not just the plane, but the cruel unpredictability of fate itself. Inside the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot worked in tense synchrony, their hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through their veins. They knew the villagers below had become an unlikely lifeline, and they trusted every judgment, every motion. The fuselage groaned under its own weight, the wings trembling, yet inch by inch it was steadied. Every bolt of sweat, every splintered plank, every stretched rope contributed to a miracle taking shape. The schoolteacher, her sleeves rolled up, her hair damp with effort, moved along the side of the plane, calling out instructions with a clarity that belied the chaos. She directed farmers to brace beams, to guide wheels over the softened soil, to absorb shocks with ropes and planks. Her calm authority became the anchor in a storm of fear, guiding ordinary villagers through extraordinary circumstances. It was a display of leadership forged in necessity, and it held the day. Finally, the moment came. The B-17's wheels touched the final stretch of the field, its damaged landing gear scraping against the earth but not giving way. The plane shuddered violently, sending dust and debris into the air. But the villagers held firm. Their synchronized effort slowed the behemoth just enough, counteracting gravity and damaged mechanics. It was a delicate balance between skill, timing, and instinct, a dance with death that the villagers had somehow learned in real time. When the plane came to a complete stop, an overwhelming wave of relief swept over everyone. Cheers erupted, though ragged and breathless, as the villagers realized what they had accomplished. Men and women who had been farmers, mechanics, and teachers only moments before were now heroes in the eyes of history. They had defied expectation, defied the limits of ordinary human capacity, and saved the lives of a crew whose fates had hung by a thread. The crew, shaken but alive, climbed out of the cockpit one by one, their faces etched with disbelief and gratitude. They embraced the villagers, offering words of thanks that could never truly capture the enormity of what had just occurred. The mechanics wiped sweat from their brows, the farmers dusted off their clothes, and the schoolteacher allowed herself a small, exhausted smile. It was a moment of quiet triumph, a testament to courage and ingenuity in the most unlikely of circumstances. Historians will later note that such rescues were virtually unheard of. The B-17, though resilient in combat, had rarely been saved from mechanical disaster by civilians. The combination of knowledge, improvisation, and courage displayed by these villagers was extraordinary, a vivid reminder that ordinary people can accomplish the unimaginable when the situation demands it. Every rope, every plank, every tool had played a role in preserving life that day. The story of the rescue spread beyond the village, reaching military bases, newspapers, and eventually the wider world. The crew recounted the actions of the villagers, praising their courage and the quick thinking. The mechanics' ingenuity, the farmer's strength, and the schoolteacher's leadership became emblematic of the often overlooked contributions of civilians during wartime. This was heroism not born of combat training or medals, but of compassion, determination, and the willingness to act when others might have frozen. In the years that followed, the villagers would often reflect on that morning. They would recall the deafening roar of engines, the smell of smoke, the feel of splintered wood in their hands, and the sight of a massive plane finally resting safely on the ground. It was a memory that bound them together, a shared experience that transcended ordinary life. They had been thrust into history, and they had risen to the occasion with courage that would inspire generations. The B-17 itself became a symbol of survival. Though battered and damaged, it remained a testament not only to the engineering of the flying fortress, but to the power of human action. The plane had faced disaster in the skies above, and it had been saved on the ground by ordinary people who refused to let fate decide. It was a rare intersection of human determination and technological resilience, a story that illustrated how heroism can appear in the most unexpected forms. Even today, the tale resonates. It reminds us that courage is not always about weapons or battles, but about action in the face of overwhelming odds. It reminds us that heroism often takes the form of quick thinking, teamwork, and selfless determination. And it reminds us that history is not only made by generals and pilots, but by farmers, mechanics, teachers, and anyone willing to step forward when the moment calls for it. As the sun set over the village that day, casting long shadows across the now quiet fields, there was a profound sense of accomplishment. A community had come together. Ordinary people had defied disaster, and a bomber crew had been given a second chance at life. The echoes of that morning would remain in memory, whispered in stories, and celebrated in quiet pride. They had faced chaos with courage, and against all odds, they had prevailed. The B-17 would eventually return to service, repaired and ready for new missions, but the legend of that morning remained. It was not the story of combat victories or medals earned in battle, but the story of humanity at its finest. A schoolteacher, farmers, and mechanics had turned a desperate moment into a triumph of spirit and ingenuity. Their courage, their quick thinking, and their selfless action had saved lives and left an indelible mark on history. And so, the tale endures, a reminder that heroism is not defined solely by rank, training, or circumstance. It is defined by the willingness to act when others cannot, to confront danger with ingenuity and heart, and to rise to the occasion when the world seems to teeter on the edge of disaster. The crash of the B-17, once a moment of potential tragedy, became a timeless testament to the extraordinary power of ordinary people, their courage, and their resolve. In the quiet of that English field, with the plane finally still and the villagers breathing with relief, the world witnessed something truly remarkable. Lives had been saved, history had been made, and the story of how a community, armed with nothing more than courage and farm tools, rescued a flying fortress, would echo through generations. It is a story of hope, heroism, and humanity, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, ordinary people can achieve the extraordinary.